As part of the Open University of Hong Kong's Distinguished Professor Seminar Series, Professor Liz Hamp Lyons presented a seminar on the importance of assessment literacy. Professor Hamp Lyons is a former head of English and chair professor of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Currently, she is a member of the Center for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment at the University of Bedfordshire in the United Kingdom. She also serves as a senior consultant to the College English Test of China. Professor Hamp Lyons began her talk by explaining the concept of assessment literacy.
Okay, so what is assessment literacy? First of all, what is it that we're talking about? Well, it's almost impossible to say what assessment literacy is because it is so many different things to different people. So it depends on the stakeholder group what it is that they need in terms of assessment literacy. However, there are some general principles or essential elements. One of them is the possession of knowledge about the basic principles of assessment practice, including the terminology, the words which are used in that specific disciplinary area. Another is the familiarity with the standards of quality in the specific assessments within your own sphere, your area of work, so that you can tell the difference between something is correctly targeted or not correctly targeted for whoever it is you are concerned to assess, and assess accurately and fairly. Another of these is, these are all obvious, but they often don't get said. The competence to judge the various different ways of assessing people's language skills. Now, although I'm being quite general in this presentation, and I don't talk about language very much, but in fact my area of interest is language and language assessment. And so in drawing this together, I've always drawn on experience in language learning and language assessment. However, there's no reason why almost everything here couldn't equally be applied to assessment of history or assessment of physical education, other areas too. And always remember that the primary purpose of assessment is to improve students' learning and teachers' teaching by responding to the information an assessment provides. If a teacher doesn't know what to do with information from an assessment, then the assessment is not very useful. Or it might be useful to report a score up to some bureaucracy, but it's not useful at all for the teachers' decisions what to teach next and at what level to tackle that material. Who needs to be assessment literate? Well, my argument fundamentally is that nearly everybody needs to be assessment literate, but in different ways, and that's part of the whole notion of different stakeholder groups, different reasons for knowing about assessment. In the current world, and in Hong Kong at least as much as elsewhere, and a lot of people would say in Hong Kong even more than elsewhere, everyone needs to be literate in assessment. And for those of you who don't have any clue why I would say that, maybe even more in Hong Kong, I would say because Hong Kong is considered internationally to be an assessment-oriented culture rather than a learning-oriented culture. So in this presentation, because I think that nearly everyone needs to be assessment literate, I'm aiming at a wider audience than experts in assessment. And I'm not aiming at experts in assessment because I don't think they need it. In fact, I do think quite a few experts in assessment do need better assessment literacy. But I think there are lots of other groups that need special kinds of assessment literacy too, and that's what I'm concerned about today. Okay, so what are stakeholders? That's really just a footnote. Stakeholders is the term that we use in assessment. So, of course, it's used in many areas, finance and so on, but it's used as a specialist term in assessment to mean identifiable groups of people with the same or very similar set of concerns related to their own purpose and their own context. This is a quote from the Ministry of Education, New Zealand. They say, parents are key stakeholders in education, and as such, they expect meaningful information about their child's progress and achievement in relation to learning entitlements. That word, entitlements, is really quite interesting in their context, because I don't know where else people think about students' learning needs, their objectives, their goals, their purposes in life, etc. I haven't heard this referred to as entitlements before, and it has quite a special meaning, which is to do with a very strong social force, but also a legal force. If people don't get their entitlements, then they are entitled to complain, to sue over it. And while that may sound a bit draconian, a bit strong, I often think, as I hear parents in the US banging on the doors to get different attitudes to education and assessment, and similarly in Hong Kong, I often think a bit less regulation and more entitlement might be quite a nice step forward. So every parent, some of you are, most of you will be, some of us have been and are now grandparents. Every parent will face the day when their child must take a test, and they're lucky if it's only a test and not a whole load of tests. And parents understand that tests will have a great impact on their child's future. But many parents don't know how to look at the information provided by the test and about the test, and how to use that information to help their child get ready emotionally as well as intellectually for that challenge of turning up and doing the best that they can. And we know that some people blossom under intellectual pressure, and some people wilt, and some others basically shrivel away. And that doesn't seem quite fair. So, parents need assessment literacy. Hong Kong parents often do think they're quite assessment literate. And my husband and I had dinner with somebody 2 nights ago who was talking about the tests that their 3-year-old was going to be taking. As if it's, very much like weaning a baby off milk, or a stage of life that's completely natural and normal. It really isn't completely natural and normal in the rest of the world. In Sweden, for example, they just don't do tests. Ever. Maybe a little bit, but basically never. So if Hong Kong parents know a lot about the assessments that have to happen here, but they don't necessarily know whether that is a good thing or a really terrible thing, or a mixed curse and blessing. Parents can help their children when they, that is the parents, are informed through descriptions of what learning and progress has happened with that child of their very own and for that child. And when they're able to share and understand information about their progress and achievement. So progress and achievement may not be exactly the same thing. Progress is often thought of as a developmental, sort of like a cornucopia, gradually opening and becoming richer. But achievement is much more thought of measurement points, step by step by step. They are, of course, closely related, but not the same. Parents are also better able to help their children when they receive reporting about their child, which is continuous and timely, with key times for formal evaluation. So not no formal evaluation, but much more than just formal evaluation. And also when assessments reported are multi-layered and multi-directional. So not just a number. And it could be quite different depending on whether the person being reported to is the student themselves, the parents, the teacher receiving aggregated scores back from a higher authority. And with higher bureaucracy included in those layers of information when necessary. And many, many people now argue that when necessary does not equal all the time. A lot of assessment possibilities within the teaching normal scope which don't need to be reported to higher bureaucracy and which would be inappropriately reported to higher bureaucracy because they don't have some essential assessment behaviours, which we'll talk about toward the end. Okay, so what about assessment literacy for students? This is an area that we don't hear very much about. It's assumed that somehow, because students are in classrooms and they're taking tests, they understand what tests are, they know about assessment, but how should they and why should they? Students need to be given the opportunity to take part in the processes of making academic judgments to help them develop appropriate evaluative expertise themselves and make more sense of and take greater control of their learning. And that's what we, in fact, did not do in school-based assessment, and one reason, possibly, why there was quite a lot of resistance from students. The resistance went away after a couple of years because the year above started telling the next year how it was when they did it, and there was no kind of conflicting story. So you do something to people long enough, it becomes the norm, however awful or wonderful it is. But yes, making judgments for themselves turns out in the research literature to be probably the most useful thing that we could do in terms of assessment literacy for learners. Teach them how to do it. So, although in some countries students are being helped to understand how and why they are assessed, it's not the norm, not by any chance. It's in many places still considered to be sort of secret. For example, there are huge tests where you cannot actually find out how they are scored. So you get maybe you go to the website and you get training materials or handbooks or whatever, and they give you a shrunken version of the scoring, a much simplified one. Or in the case of Cambridge tests, they give you a somewhat developed one, but it's not exactly what the people really doing the judgment use. And so it's, to me it feels slightly dishonest. And people seem to think, well, if they know how they're being scored, that's a form of cheating. How can it be? How can it be? What do you think? How can you cheat if you know what the basis of your judgment is? Okay, you'd learn to be particularly good at the thing that you're being judged on. Is that cheating? Yeah. And if it's open to everybody, then everybody has the chance to become very good on those particular features. If they don't bother, well, that's entirely their right. The people who do bother and who score better as a result, they have done some work. They've done some pretty smart work. Why shouldn't they do well? So for me, that's something that really should be changed. Although a lot has happened over the last 15 years, there's still quite a long way to go. And in some countries, all the way to go. Learners can help themselves when they're assessment literate because it gives them power. And maybe that's one reason why even teachers perhaps, but certainly bureaucracies resist it or don't trust it. Or if students know too much, that gives them a kind of an upper hand on us. But that's only a very insecure person's point of view, in my view. So it gives them power, partly because it lets them control their own learning goals. So not only can they choose to do more work in key areas that they know are going to be assessed, it also lets them choose not to. If they say, okay, I don't want to be a biologist, thank you very much, so I'm going to do just enough that I think I'm going to pass this unavoidable exam, but I'm going to put all that energy that I didn't spend cramming in it onto this other subject, maybe my Chinese or my English, and I'm going to do much more on that because it's going to matter to me, I think, in my life. So I'm prioritizing. That's a kind of power. And of course, when they're assessment literate, they have much better ability to understand the tests and make decisions like I just mentioned. And that means that the scores they get are a truer reflection of what they can do. And also, to some extent, a reflection of what they care about. I don't think those are bad things. And it provides them with the skill, and this is where the insecurity may creep in higher up the pecking order, provides them with the skill that they would need to question scores they are given or request deeper explanations of how this whole thing was worked out. And as you may have heard in some media somewhere in the UK, there's been like an explosion of distrust of the large-scale school exams that channel people in terms of the opportunities for higher education. And in some subjects in the last few years, there have been, 60% of students appealed their test score. And about 10 years ago, Educational Testing Service is probably one of the very biggest testing organizations in the world. They lost their right to administer tests in Britain completely because so many students appealed this one ETS test, don't remember what it was, that they had to cancel the whole thing. And so then those students were left with nothing to report to universities. It was an enormous scandal. So what about assessment literacy for school staff? And again, this is a bit of a touchy area, partly because teachers feel under threat. And of course, the more students appeal, the more under threat teachers are going to feel. But also because all the education experts agree that this is a difficult job that isn't given enough support. So this is the Higher Education Academy of UK. These are the people who certify, authorise the teaching expertise of university teachers, which is a fairly new venture. Didn't used to need any teaching qualifications to teach at university. And it says assessment literacy is an iterative process. You learn something, you do something, then you need to learn something else, then you do some more. So it's back and forth, learning and doing all the time. Iterative process, therefore, course design and implementation should provide unhurried opportunities and time within and across programs to develop complex knowledge and skills and create clear paths for progression. Understanding and managing the range of information that counts as evidence of student learning and achievement can be daunting, and it requires teachers and school leaders to be confident in their assessment literacy. If you're just doing things because you've been told that that's the thing you do in your school, and you're just following orders, and somebody comes up and questions you, you've no confidence to support with a sensible explanation why you're doing what you're doing. And that is the really weak point for many teachers, is they haven't gone deep enough into why it matters that you teach people Putonghua as a second language with certain methodologies and not with others, or why you have to teach Putonghua differently to speakers of English and French and Spanish than you might have to do teaching it to speakers of Japanese or Arabic. And teachers working within the school or other institution on curriculum development also need to be assessment literate, so that they all share the objectives and the goals of what these kids really need and how we can best deliver it to them. And what's assessment got to do with that? Well, of course, assessment is like a way of marking how it's going forward. Teachers can help their learners best when they and their department heads have the assessment literacy skills to discharge their assessment duties properly, keep up to date with new ideas in assessment relevant to their teaching context, protect their learners' right to the highest quality and most humanistic assessments, respond respectfully and seriously to questions from students and parents about their or their child's learning progress and their assessment results. In fact, research suggests that teachers spend from 1/3 to 1/4 of their professional time on assessment-related activities, and I suspect that in Hong Kong it's more than that. That's a kind of a broad average. Okay, so now we arrive at one of the wider groups of stakeholders, curriculum developers, who may not be a huge number of people in any particular society, but they are a significant group of people. The primary purpose of assessment is to improve students' learning, as both student and teacher respond to the information that assessment provides. Unfortunately, sometimes teachers and learners respond even if the assessment provides bad information, because if teachers and leaders are not assessment literate, how are they going to know whether it's good or bad information? Information is needed about what knowledge, understandings, or skills students need. So that means you have to know that as an underlying set of competencies of curriculum developers, because they could design the cleverest curriculum and the cutest materials for nobody in particular. So randomly they might suit some people, but they would fail to suit lots of other people. By finding out what students currently know, what they understand, what they can do, any gap between what we want them to be able to know and do and what they can know and do can be identified. Once that's happened, then that assessment of what's missing can be fed forward to create an assessment for a future time to show whether or not an instructional process or program in between has actually been successful. And that is closing the gap, or at least making the gap smaller. And this again is from the Ministry of Education, New Zealand. So fundamentally, curriculum development is or should be about closing that gap, making sure materials provided to teachers to support learners through a learning progression fit their need and interest, and to make sure they're doable within the syllabus structure, which, as we said before, is often where it all falls apart. And curriculum best supports learners when the assessment tasks are also learning tasks. This is assessment for learning, one of the little buzz terms, or learning-oriented assessment. Learning tasks can be used as accessible events, so that those two are the reverses of each other, and it shows that it can be a cycle going in either direction. The curriculum materials clearly need to specify not only learning goals, but how the tasks put in front of teachers and their students can be used to support learning. So it's no good having just the stuff if you don't support teachers in delivering it and students in working with it. Everything I say is so obvious, but when you put it all together as a package, there's a huge amount that doesn't happen in just about any context. You can look at all these points, you could make it a checklist, and you tick happily until a certain point and you go, uh-oh, wrong, not doing that. So curriculum best supports learners when it is designed to provide unhurried opportunities and time within and across programs to develop complex knowledge. And also, good curriculum will help teachers and learners to clearly understand how every task and every unit of work builds up into a full understanding of an ability to perform to meet some educational objective that itself fists into a clear path for progression. And by clear, what we have to mean is that it's not just clear to the curriculum developer who made it, but it's clear to the teachers who are trying to deliver it, and it's clear to the students who want to know what they should be doing and whether they're doing it the right way. Also, often forgotten, good curriculum helps teachers enormously with planning their time well. Then you get far fewer of these, well, I wanted to do this, I wanted to teach the students this, I wanted to help them in a particular humanistic way, but I couldn't because there's no time. Summary so far, we've seen that almost every citizen has a role to play in a learner's learning, or they will have someday when they become parents, or they have had in the past, and as grandparents, not only remember it, but become equally anxious, or even more anxious. At any moment in time, a large number of citizens do have a major role in education as one form of stakeholder, often as several. Because often teachers are parents, and some teachers are on educational committees and subcommittees, etc. Plenty of policymakers are also parents at some point in their lives. So the roles should include, whichever it is, some degree of responsibility that demands assessment literacy, because actually you can't work in education and pretend that assessment doesn't exist unless you're so assessment illiterate that you literally would fall over a test and break your nose and still not realize what it was that you had fallen over. And I've never seen anybody like that. However, as Napoleon the pig said, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. So now we come to professionals in assessment. That is about the only joke I've got in this presentation, and it's obviously a bit obscure. Professionals in assessment aren't more equal than others, but some of them think they are. And the fact that I now mention various assessment bodies is not me having a particular attack on anyone. I'm just naming big test professional groups. Hong Kong Examinations and Assessment Authority, the Language Testing and Training Centre in Taiwan, which is basically like the partner of the HKEAA. Cambridge Assessment in UK, which is huge and responsible for IELTS and first certificate and certificate of proficiency in English, many English language tests. Educational Testing Service in the US, responsible for the TOEFL, which I mentioned earlier, which shows that even the big, rich, famous groups can get themselves into trouble. And the College English Test Committee of China. All these people need a high level of technical literacy for assessment. All of these people, maybe with the exception of the CET group, which is astonishingly small, considering they test 18 million people a year, all the others have some staff with very high assessment literacy skills and some with essentially none, because they work in the filing department or whatever. Whereas my view would be, if you work there, you should know what your company does. So of course they need those things, but they also need something else, something more ethical, intangible perhaps, an advanced sense of the effects of tests and other assessments on learners, and by extension on their families, and again by extension on the society. They also need humility about the power that comes along with the role of decision making about how other people are assessed. This is a major responsibility with major stakes. And here I'm using stakes, again, in a specific assessment technical way. It is related to stakeholders, but when we talk about the stakes of a test, we're really referring to how much the person taking the test has got to lose or gain from what happens after they get their results from that test. So the higher the stakes, the more powerful that test is, the greater the humility we should have when we work in that environment, in my opinion. Test professionals support education best when they're closely wired into and with schools or the education a context where their assessment tools will be used. That sounds something else, sounds so obvious, and yet in many of those large testing organizations it's not true. They've got their great big offices. ETS is in an enormous park, like an old British aristocracy, mansion grounds, with deer grazing everywhere and swans on the lake and so on. Miles from any town, and the closest town is Princeton, which is one of the top 5 universities in the US. It's a little bit up in the clouds of reality. And they support education best when they have teachers included wherever possible in advisory teams, in test development activities, also in trialling in schools or in colleges of pilot potential tests. And when they consistently upgrade their knowledge in their field through continuing professional development and by attending conferences and consultations where other stakeholder groups have the primary voices. So going to conferences which are for and by teachers, not just conferences that are for and by testers, for example. And they are at their best when they accept that there is no perfect assessment tool. So therefore they, and because I'm one in one part of my life, I have to say we can never stop aiming to do better. Those working in government or policy in education need to be assessment literate. But we would like to see all these people have all the skills, everything I've said, all those stakeholder groups. Those top people are earning top salaries, and they should educate themselves if they haven't actually acquired this multiple assessment literacy as they've gone along. They should just educate themselves with honesty and humility when they take on that role, because this is not trivial. Ultimate power brings ultimate responsibility. As there's no absolutely right path forward for policymakers and bureaucrats, that means they should always be listening to what's going on and what new ideas are out there and who's saying what, and reflecting on everything that they do and how well they do it. These 5 points are absolutely key. They're the only really technical language that I've used in this talk, and I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to leave them there. Some of you know this all already. This is actually a very simplistic set of definitions. Thinking as a professional tester, I would not agree with this 100%, but it's simple enough to grasp for the moment. If you're interested, then of course you go and read more and you discover more complexity. I think now we have a joke coming, finally. This is a joke. The man behind the desk says, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb the tree. And we have a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a goldfish, a seal, and a dog. Supposedly, it may be apocryphal, I've looked it up and nobody really knows if Albert Einstein did say this, but somebody did. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Now this joke was one of the big sticking points when we were trying to introduce school-based assessment, because teachers were saying, but it's teachers assessing their own students in their classroom. How do I know that the teachers in that school just down the road won't cheat? How do I know that I won't cheat? How do I manage to trust myself? No, it's always, we are all squeaky clean in this school, but that school down the road, they're probably horrible people who lie and cheat. And they're all people, they're all the same people if you put them into one group. And I wrote several papers explaining the unfairness of absolute identical treatment. And I think I convinced maybe 20% of the teachers. So how many of you think having exactly the same test for every kid in a school is fair? Some people take longer to learn things, but they may learn them as well eventually. So simply the question of time becomes an issue, a sort of an intervening variable, a plan that can mess up understanding how good people really are at whatever. But that is something that needs quite a lot of thought. And when you have your own children and you see them either succeeding or struggling relative to their peers or what you think their peers might be doing, you would probably at some point say, well, yeah, but that's not fair because I know that little Wong is actually very, very good at vocabulary. But the test that he just took, they didn't have a vocabulary section on it, so this test isn't fair. But there are other kids who are very, very good at something else, which was there. Next test, it might be the opposite. But what are we going to do about it? We have to live with the fact that life isn't fair, and we should make sure everybody gets the opportunities to demonstrate what they can do. Thank you all very much indeed.